When we think of the Civil War, we picture soldiers in blue and gray, cannons thundering, and brother fighting against brother. But behind the smoke of battle was another story, the story of what Americans ate to survive. Food was scarce, rations were rough, and luxuries were almost impossible to come by. Soldiers on both sides carried haversacks filled with hardtack, salt pork, and dried beans. Civilians at home made do with substitutes, foraging for wild greens or baking bread sweetened with molasses instead of sugar. Every meal told a story of struggle, sacrifice, and ingenuity. Some of these foods were so tough they could break your teeth. Others were so strange that soldiers gave them cruel nicknames. Yet every single one kept millions of Americans alive during one of the darkest chapters in the nation's history. In this video, we'll step back in time to uncover 15 foods Americans ate during the Civil War. Some remembered fondly, others hated passionately, but all of them essential to survival. These are the meals that fueled a nation divided. Right arrow, and we begin with perhaps the most infamous food of the Civil War, a cracker so hard it was more weapon than meal. If there was one food that defined the Civil War soldier's diet, it was hardtack, a cracker so tough it earned the nickname Tooth Duller. Hardtack was nothing more than flour, water, and salt, baked into a dry, square biscuit. It was cheap to make, easy to transport, and could last for years without spoiling. Union and Confederate soldiers alike carried stacks of it in their haversacks as their main ration. The problem was, hardtack was nearly inedible. Freshly baked, it was already hard as a board. After months in storage, it became even tougher, sometimes crawling with weevils, worms, or mold. Soldiers joked that it was hard enough to stop a bullet, and many soaked it in coffee or fried it in pork grease just to make it chewable. Why did it matter? Hardtack was survival. It gave soldiers the calories they needed to march and fight, even if it broke their teeth in the process. Letters home are filled with both complaints and dark humor about these biscuits. For many men, hardtack became a symbol of army life, monotonous, grueling, and unrelenting. The emotional twist? Despite its reputation, hardtack is one of the most remembered Civil War foods. Veterans would even keep pieces as souvenirs long after the war ended, a hard, crumbling reminder of what they endured. Hardtack wasn't loved, but it was unforgettable, a meal, a memory, and a symbol of just how difficult daily survival was in the Civil War. Right arrow, and while hardtack was a soldier's daily bread, the next staple was far greasier and not always fit for human consumption: salt pork. If hardtack was the soldier's bread, then salt pork was the meat, though calling it a delicacy would be a stretch. Salt pork was exactly what it sounds like: slabs of fatty pork preserved in heavy salt. It was cheap, easy to store, and could last for months without refrigeration, making it ideal for army rations. Soldiers were issued small portions alongside hardtack, giving them at least some protein to fuel their marches and battles. But in reality, salt pork was far from appetizing. Some pieces were rancid, crawling with maggots, or so oversalted they were nearly inedible. Soldiers often had to boil it, fry it, or stew it with beans just to choke it down. For many, the smell alone became unforgettable, a greasy, salty reminder of army life. Why did it matter? Salt pork represented the military's attempt to feed millions of men on the move. It wasn't about flavor or variety. It was about calories and preservation. In some cases, families back home also relied on salt pork as one of the few affordable meats available during wartime shortages. The emotional twist? Despite its grim reputation, salt pork became part of countless soldiers' most vivid memories. Some remembered it with disgust, others with a strange kind of nostalgia. It wasn't a meal anyone craved, but it was survival, and survival often leaves the strongest impressions. Salt pork was greasy, salty, and sometimes spoiled, but for countless soldiers, it was the difference between hunger and making it through another day. Right arrow, and while salt pork left soldiers greasy and thirsty, the next Civil War staple was the complete opposite: a plain, watery porridge known as cornmeal mush. When meat was scarce and bread was hard to come by, many Americans turned to one of the simplest foods of all: cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush was exactly what its name suggests. Cornmeal boiled in water or milk until it thickened into a porridge. It was cheap, filling, and versatile. Soldiers might eat it plain in camp, while families at home often served it with molasses or fried it into slices the next day for variety. Corn was one of the most abundant crops in 19th century America, especially in the South, which made mush a natural choice during the Civil War. Union soldiers often called it hasty pudding, while Confederate households leaned on it as a daily staple when flour and wheat were harder to come by. Why did it matter? Cornmeal mush was a great equalizer. It was eaten by soldiers and civilians, the wealthy and the poor. In an era of shortages, it stretched ingredients further than almost any other dish. Children, in particular, often grew up on cornmeal mush when other foods were simply unavailable. The emotional twist? For some, mush became a comfort food remembered fondly from childhood. For others, it symbolized poverty and hard times, a reminder of meals where there was no choice, only necessity. To this day, cornmeal mush lingers in Southern cooking traditions, though few remember its Civil War roots. Cornmeal mush may not have been exciting, but in a time of war and want, it was the kind of meal that quietly kept people alive. Rightero, but while mush was plain and predictable, the next drink was anything but a creative substitute soldiers brewed when their beloved coffee ran out. For Civil War soldiers, coffee wasn't just a drink, it was a lifeline. And when it ran out, desperation brewed some unusual replacements. Union soldiers especially loved their coffee. Letters and diaries describe steaming mugs of it as one of the few comforts they had during long marches and brutal battles. But when real coffee beans were scarce, especially in the blockaded South, substitutes began to appear. People roasted chicory root, dandelion root, acorns, corn, peas, and even sweet potatoes to create something that looked like coffee, smelled a little like coffee, and sometimes even fooled the taste buds. Confederate soldiers nicknamed these drinks Lincoln coffee or Yankee coffee, mocking their weak flavor. Why did it matter? Coffee was more than a beverage. It was morale. Soldiers used it to stay awake, warm their bodies, and feel human for a brief moment in inhuman conditions. For families at home, substitutes showed resilience and ingenuity, finding ways to preserve daily rituals even when luxuries were cut off by war. The emotional twist? Many veterans later recalled that coffee, real or fake, was one of the most cherished parts of soldiering. It wasn't about the taste, but the comfort it brought. In the middle of mud, hunger, and gunfire, a warm cup of coffee could feel like a piece of home. Civil War coffee substitutes may not have satisfied the tongue, but they fed the spirit, and sometimes that was even more important. Rightero, and while soldiers sipped on makeshift coffee, their campfires often turned out another quick staple, griddlecakes known as slapjacks. For Civil War soldiers, coffee wasn't just a drink, it was a lifeline. And when it ran out, desperation brewed some unusual replacements. Union soldiers especially loved their coffee. Letters and diaries describe steaming mugs of it as one of the few comforts they had during long marches and brutal battles. But when real coffee beans were scarce, especially in the blockaded South, substitutes began to appear. People roasted chicory root, dandelion root, acorns, corn, peas, and even sweet potatoes to create something that looked like coffee, smelled a little like coffee, and sometimes even fooled the taste buds. Confederate soldiers nicknamed these drinks Lincoln coffee or Yankee coffee, mocking their weak flavor. Why did it matter? Coffee was more than a beverage. It was morale. Soldiers used it to stay awake, warm their bodies, and feel human for a brief moment in inhuman conditions. For families at home, substitutes showed resilience and ingenuity, finding ways to preserve daily rituals even when luxuries were cut off by war. The emotional twist? Many veterans later recalled that coffee, real or fake, was one of the most cherished parts of soldiering. It wasn't about the taste, but the comfort it brought. In the middle of mud, hunger, and gunfire, a warm cup of coffee could feel like a piece of home. Civil War coffee substitutes may not have satisfied the tongue, but they fed the spirit, and sometimes that was even more important. Right-arrow, and while soldiers sipped on makeshift coffee, their campfires often turned out another quick staple: griddlecakes, known as slapjacks. Imagine opening your ration bag, hoping for something fresh and colorful, only to find a brick of dried, shredded plants that soldiers quickly nicknamed desecrated vegetables. In the 1860s, preserving food for long campaigns was a major challenge. To solve the problem, the government issued compressed blocks of dried carrots, turnips, parsnips, celery, and sometimes even beets. Officially, they were called desiccated vegetables. But to the men in the field, the name quickly morphed into desecrated, because that's exactly how they tasted. The blocks were supposed to be boiled in water, turning into a hearty soup or stew. But in reality, soldiers described them as leathery, bitter, and nearly impossible to digest. Many claimed the smell alone was enough to turn a man's stomach. And yet, these vegetables serve an important purpose. They were meant to prevent scurvy, a dangerous disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. Why did they matter? Despite the jokes and disgust, desiccated vegetables were one of the earliest attempts at large-scale military nutrition science. The Army recognized the need for vitamins, even if they didn't yet understand the chemistry behind it. These humble bricks, as hated as they were, represented progress in keeping soldiers healthy. The emotional twist? Many troops would rather risk sickness than eat the dreaded rations. In fact, some soldiers reportedly burned or buried the vegetable bricks instead of cooking them. Letters home are filled with sarcastic remarks, with one Union soldier writing that the blocks were a cross between old boots and sawdust. In the end, desecrated vegetables became a running joke of the Civil War, a symbol of how innovation sometimes tastes worse than the problem it was meant to solve. Right-arrow, and if you thought dried vegetables were bad, wait until you hear what soldiers made out of old, hard coffee beans on the march. For many Civil War soldiers, a cup of coffee in the morning wasn't just a luxury, it was survival. But when beans ran out, desperation brewed some strange alternatives. Coffee was so beloved during the Civil War that soldiers would march miles just for the promise of a hot cup. Union soldiers were often issued real beans, but supply shortages meant it didn't always last. Confederates had it even worse. With the Union blockade cutting off imports, Southern troops quickly turned to substitutes. Anything that could be roasted, ground, and steeped in hot water. What kind of substitutes? Soldiers experimented with roasted chicory root, peanuts, acorns, corn, rye, okra seeds, and even ground-up sweet potatoes. These drinks were usually bitter, weak, and far from the rich, comforting taste of coffee. But for men stuck in camps or on the march, the ritual of holding a steaming tin cup was almost as important as the flavor itself. Why did it matter? Coffee wasn't just about caffeine. It was about morale. In the midst of cold nights, long marches, and the chaos of battle, coffee offered a small reminder of home. One Union soldier famously wrote, "If it is possible, give the men coffee. Nothing will contribute more to their health and contentment." The emotional twist? While the South was forced to get creative with substitutes, the Union Army actually made coffee a defining part of its identity. Some historians argue that Northern soldiers' access to real coffee gave them a psychological edge, an overlooked detail in the story of the war. For many veterans, the smell of roasting coffee would forever be tied to memories of campfires, comrades, and survival. In the end, coffee wasn't just a drink, it was a lifeline. And when the beans ran dry, soldiers discovered just how far they'd go to keep the ritual alive. Right-arrow, but if you think coffee substitutes sound bad, wait until you hear about the hardtack biscuits so tough, some soldiers carved them into game pieces instead of eating them. Imagine a cracker so tough it could break your teeth or double as a letter home. For Civil War soldiers, that cracker had a name: hardtack. Hardtack was the ultimate soldier's ration. Made from just flour, water, and a pinch of salt, it was baked into thick square biscuits, so dense they could last for years. These dry, rock-hard crackers were easy to transport, nearly indestructible, and cheap to produce, exactly what a massive army needed on long campaigns. But eating hardtack was no small task. Soldiers often joked that it was less food and more construction material. To soften it, men would soak the biscuits in coffee, stew, or even whiskey if they had it. Some would fry them in bacon grease to make them edible. Others carved their initials into them or used them as playing cards when meals were scarce. Why did it matter? Hardtack became the most recognizable food of the Civil War. It was a symbol of endurance, something simple, unglamorous, and absolutely necessary. Whether Union or Confederate, nearly every soldier had a story about gnawing on the indestructible crackers. It bound the men together in shared hardship. The emotional twist? Hardtack wasn't just tough, it was alive. Stored for months in damp barrels, the crackers often arrived infested with weevils, tiny worms, or maggots. Soldiers would dunk them in hot liquid just to float the bugs out before taking a bite. And yet, despite the disgust, many veterans later recalled hardtack with a strange fondness. It became part of their identity, a taste of survival that followed them home. In the end, hardtack was more than just a biscuit. It was a reminder that sometimes the simplest foods carried men through the darkest days. Right arrow, but as tough as hardtack was, it couldn't compare to the mystery meat rations that soldiers nicknamed Salt Horse. If hardtack was the brick of the Civil War diet, then salt meat was the glue that held it together, though many soldiers swore it was tougher than leather. For both Union and Confederate troops, meat usually came in the form of heavily salted pork or beef. Barrels of meat were packed in brine, designed to last months without spoiling. By the time it reached the front lines, though it was often gray, stringy, and so salty that soldiers had to boil it multiple times just to make it edible. Union soldiers jokingly called it Salt Horse, while Confederates often had even less access to it, sometimes receiving rancid cuts that were barely fit for consumption. Yet despite the complaints, salt pork and beef were vital, providing badly needed protein to men who burned thousands of calories a day on the march or in battle. Why did it matter? Salt meat was a direct link to the logistical side of war. The ability to supply armies with preserved protein was a massive achievement at the time. For many soldiers, this was their only real source of sustenance beyond bread or beans. It was also a morale issue. A soldier's day often rose or fell, depending on whether the salt pork was edible. The emotional twist? Many men were haunted by it. Veterans later wrote about the smell of rancid meat boiling in camp kettles as one of the most unforgettable and unpleasant memories of the war. Some even claimed they could never look at salted pork again after they returned home. But for others, that simple, greasy ration was what kept them alive. In the end, Salt Horse was a symbol of sacrifice, food that was never meant to be enjoyed, only endured. Right arrow, and if the meat was bad, the beans soldiers ate with it weren't much better. Next, we'll look at the humble ration that earned the nickname Soldier's Comfort. They called them Soldier's Comfort, but for many men in the Civil War, beans were both a blessing and a curse. Army beans, usually navy beans or small white beans, were one of the most common rations for soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Dried beans were cheap, easy to store, and full of protein. For Union soldiers especially, beans were a staple, often boiled into thick stews with salt pork or flavored with whatever scraps they could find. Around campfires, the aroma of simmering beans became as familiar as the sound of bugles. Why do they matter? Beans weren't just filling, they were symbolic. They represented stability in a time when food supplies were uncertain. A pot of beans could feed dozens of men, fueling them for long marches or the chaos of battle. In fact, the term Army beans became so iconic that even after the war, many veterans associated them with their time in service. But the emotional twist came in the form of their side effects. Beans were notorious for causing indigestion, bloating, and worse, earning plenty of crude jokes among soldiers. Letters from the front often poke fun at how comfort quickly turned into discomfort after a meal of beans. And for Confederate soldiers, beans were far rarer, making them more of a luxury than a routine ration. Despite the grumbling, beans were deeply tied to memory. Veterans later recalled how the humble stew warmed them during bitter winters, turning a campfire into a brief moment of home. In the end, Army beans weren't glamorous, but they were steady, dependable, and unforgettable, much like the soldiers who ate them. Right arrow, but while beans could fill the belly, sometimes soldiers had to get creative with foraged ingredients, like the bitter greens and roots they found growing wild near camp. When the army rations ran out, soldiers often turned to the land itself, pulling dinner straight from the fields, forests, and riverbanks. During the Civil War, food supplies were unpredictable. Long campaigns, poor transportation, and constant skirmishes meant soldiers frequently went hungry. To survive, they foraged. Men gathered dandelion greens, wild onions, pokeweed shoots, and even dug up roots like turnips or wild potatoes. These weren't luxuries. They were survival food, often boiled into makeshift stews or eaten raw when nothing else was available. Why did it matter? Foraged foods weren't just about calories. They also provided vital nutrients, especially vitamin C, which could prevent scurvy. Soldiers who stumbled upon a patch of wild greens felt as though fortune itself had smiled on them. For Confederates in particular, who faced harsher shortages due to Union blockades, foraging often made the difference between endurance and collapse. The emotional twist came in the desperation behind it. Men wrote about scouring the countryside like scavengers, plucking leaves and roots that most people would never consider food. Some even risked punishment by sneaking into nearby farms to snatch vegetables or raid gardens. And yet, for many soldiers, the taste of something fresh, no matter how bitter, was a brief, almost forgotten joy amid the endless salted meat and hardtack. In letters home, veterans later recalled the strange comfort of boiling wild dandelions or chewing on onions dug from a riverbank. It was a reminder of how close they lived to nature and how thin the line was between survival and starvation. In the end, these foraged greens weren't just food. They were a lifeline pulled straight from the earth, proof that survival often depended on resourcefulness. Right arrow, and when greens weren't enough, soldiers sometimes relied on a surprisingly sweet treat from the fields, sorghum molasses. In a world of salt pork and hardtack, sweetness was rare. But for Civil War soldiers, one golden syrup became a treasured taste of home, sorghum molasses. Made from the stalks of the sorghum cane plant, this thick, dark syrup was a Southern staple long before the war. Farmers could easily grow sorghum, and the process of boiling down its juice into molasses made it cheap, plentiful, and durable. Unlike refined sugar, which became scarce and expensive due to wartime blockades, sorghum was locally available and quickly became the South's go-to sweetener. Why did it matter? Sorghum molasses wasn't just a treat, it was fuel. Soldiers stirred it into cornmeal mush, drizzled it over biscuits, or even mixed it with water for a makeshift energy drink. A spoonful of sorghum could transform a bland ration into something comforting, reminding men of breakfasts back home. In camps and hospitals alike, it also served as a quick source of calories for the sick and wounded. The emotional twist came in how prized it was. Soldiers often wrote home begging for jars of sorghum, treating it like liquid gold. For many Confederate troops, sorghum was one of the few sweet things they had during the war. Even Union soldiers who tasted it sometimes wrote about the novelty of its rich, earthy flavor. Veterans would later remember sorghum as a symbol of wartime endurance, something both humble and deeply comforting. In the end, sorghum molasses wasn't just syrup. It was sweetness in a bitter time, a reminder that even in war, small comforts could mean everything. Right arrow, but sweetness didn't always come from syrup. Sometimes it came in the form of cornmeal cakes, baked in ashes when no ovens were around. With no ovens, no bakeries, and often no flour, soldiers turned to a simple, old recipe from America's earliest days, the Johnnycake. Johnnycakes were flat, hearty cakes made from cornmeal, water, and sometimes a pinch of salt. They could be fried on a skillet, baked on a hot rock, or even cooked directly in campfire ashes. Cornmeal was especially common in the South, where wheat flour was scarce, but both Confederate and Union soldiers came to rely on these dense little cakes. Why did they matter? Cornbread and Johnnycakes were practical. Cornmeal was cheap, widely grown, and easy to transport. Unlike wheat bread, which required yeast and more delicate handling. Cornmeal cakes could be whipped up quickly with whatever soldiers had on hand. They provided essential calories on long marches, and when mixed with sorghum molasses, they offered a rare moment of real flavor. The emotional twist came in their connection to home. For many men, especially those from rural families, the taste of cornmeal was deeply nostalgic. It reminded them of kitchens back on the farm, of mothers frying cornbread in cast-iron pans. Letters from soldiers often mention the comfort of eating a Johnnycake by the fire, even if it was charred or undercooked. And yet, for others, eating it day after day became a symbol of the endless monotony of war. In time, Johnnycakes became part of Civil War lore. Veterans recalled them with both weariness and fondness. A food that was plain but dependable, much like the men who ate them. In the end, Johnnycakes weren't just rations. They were survival disguised as comfort, a reminder of home cooked with nothing but fire and determination. Right arrow, but sometimes soldiers didn't have cornmeal, beans, or even hardtack. In desperate times, they made do with a strange flour made from parched corn, kush. When rations ran out and desperation set in, soldiers turned to a dish as humble as it gets, something they called kush. Kush was a simple meal made from parched cornmeal fried in bacon grease or boiled with water until it became a thick mush. Sometimes onions or scraps of meat were added, but most of the time it was just cornmeal and whatever fat a soldier could spare. Quick to make, easy to fill a stomach, and endlessly adaptable, kush became a Confederate campfire classic. Why did it matter? In the South especially, where shortages were extreme, kush was survival food. Unlike beans or wheat flour, corn was plentiful across the region, and it could be carried easily in a soldier's haversack. Frying it in bacon grease not only gave it flavor, but also provided much-needed fat for energy. For many soldiers, kush became a dependable fallback when official rations failed. The emotional twist came in its dual reputation. To some soldiers, kush was comfort, a warm, filling dish that reminded them of home cooking on the farm. But for others, it was a grim symbol of deprivation, a meal eaten because there was nothing else left. Veterans later recalled both the taste and the emotions tied to it, some laughing about how much kush they ate, others grimacing at the memory. Kush lived on after the war, too. In rural areas, versions of parched cornmeal mush continued as a traditional dish, a reminder of the resilience and ingenuity born out of necessity. In the end, kush was more than just camp food. It was proof that even in the leanest times, soldiers could take almost nothing and make it into a meal. Right arrow, and when even cornmeal ran short, some soldiers turned to the land again, boiling wild berries and fruits for a rare sweet bite. In a world of hardtack and salt pork, nothing felt more like a gift from heaven than stumbling across a patch of wild berries. When supply wagons failed or rations ran thin, soldiers often turned to the countryside for nourishment. Fields, forests, and hedgerows offered wild blackberries, strawberries, persimmons, pawpaws, and apples. Soldiers would gather them during marches or while encamped, sometimes eating them fresh, other times boiling them down into jams or mixing them with cornmeal for added flavor. Why did it matter? Fresh fruit wasn't just a treat, it was medicine. The vitamins found in berries and apples helped ward off scurvy, a constant threat during long campaigns with limited diets. For soldiers who lived for months on preserved foods, the burst of sweetness from a wild fruit was both physically restoring and emotionally uplifting. The emotional twist came in the way soldiers described these moments. Diaries and letters home often mention how a handful of berries could brighten an entire day, offering a rare taste of freshness in the midst of dust, gunpowder, and salted rations. Confederate soldiers, in particular, relied heavily on foraged fruits when official supplies collapsed. Some even raided orchards along their routes, knowing a ripe apple or peach might be the only sweet thing they'd taste for months. For many veterans, the memory of eating fruit straight from the land lingered long after the war. It wasn't just food, it was a reminder of the natural beauty around them, even in the darkest times. In the end, wild berries and fruits were more than a snack. They were small, fleeting miracles that made soldiers feel human again. Right arrow, but not every forage food was a delight. Some men resorted to roasting acorns and nuts, creating bitter substitutes just to keep going. When we look back at the Civil War, we often remember the battles, the generals, and the great turning points in history. But behind every march, every skirmish, and every long night by the campfire, there was the question of food. From hardtack and salt horse to forage berries and molasses-sweetened Johnnycakes, these simple meals tell a quieter story of the war, one of survival, sacrifice, and ingenuity. Food was more than just fuel. It was a taste of home in the midst of chaos, a moment of comfort in the face of fear, and sometimes a bitter reminder of hardship. Soldiers laughed about their rations, complained about their beans, and dreaded their desecrated vegetables. But these foods carried them through one of the hardest chapters in American history. And as we remember these dishes today, we're reminded of how much they meant, not just as meals, but as memories. Meals that tied soldiers to their families, to their childhoods, and to the America they were fighting for. In the end, the foods of the Civil War may not have been glamorous, but they were unforgettable. They tell us that even in the darkest times, people found a way to endure. If you enjoyed this journey into forgotten foods of the past, don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend who loves history, and subscribe for more stories about the America we remember. Because sometimes the smallest details, like what we ate, tell us the biggest truths about who we are.